Hello, everyone. I'm Sid Melcher, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and I welcome you to our first event of 2021-2022 program year, featuring Dr. Katherine Brown, who's President and CEO of Global Ties US. First, I want to thank our program sponsors, Glen Meadow, Sir Speedy, and Wilbraham and Munson Academy. We are also pleased to partner with Valley Eye Radio, which will rebroadcast this event for their audience with low vision and print disabilities. Thank you also to Jeremy Cole of JD Cole TV, who will make today's program available on our website. Our next event will be on Wednesday, September 22nd at 7 p.m., featuring the State Department's Ryan Murphy on sports diplomacy in Western Massachusetts and beyond. And also, we are again co-presenting with the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, the Global Security Forum 2021, which will take place in person at Goodwin College in East Hartford and online on Saturday, October 2nd from 8:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. If you aren't currently getting our email updates, please go to our website at wacwestma.org and subscribe to get more information about those events and our other activities. Katherine Brown is President of CEO of Global Ties US, which the World Affairs Council partners with, along with the US Department of State in supporting the International Visitor Leadership Program, which brings up and coming leaders from around the world to the US to network and exchange best practices with their peers here, although for the last year and a half, those exchanges have been virtual. Through that program, we have hosted many visitors from Afghanistan in recent years, most notably a public health project in 2016, focusing particularly on women's health and improving maternity and birth outcomes. Many of you will remember Dr. Brown spoke at our 2019 annual meeting when she spoke about her book, Your Country, Our War, The Press and Diplomacy in Afghanistan. So while Dr. Brown, in her role as head of Global Ties US, would under any circumstances be concerned about the safety and security of IVLP alumni from Afghanistan, this is a good deal more personal for her. Before joining Global Ties US, she was a public policy manager at Facebook Incorporated, where she also was in residence as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow. She served as the executive director of the US Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy at the State Department, and she previously served as an assistant to the National Security Advisor at the White House, as a communications advisor at the American Embassy in Kabul, and as a professional staff member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs at the US House of Representatives. She will be in conversation today with Steve Spellman, who is the interim president of the World Affairs Council's Board of Directors. Germane to today's program, from Steve's biography, he is retired as a colonel in the US Army Reserves in 2013. For most of his military career, he served as a foreign area officer. He deployed twice to Iraq, once with Army Special Forces in 2004, excuse me, and then again in 2007 as a senior military officer at the Law and Order Task Force. He also has experience with US political and military activities in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. So I'm going to turn off my camera and turn things over to Steve and Katherine. Thank you.
Thanks, Sid. Good morning, Dr. Brown. Great to have you here with us. Folks, I just want to let you know Dr. Brown is not here today to provide answers on exactly what will happen next in Afghanistan, what's going on today, or what the US government should have done, or how they should have done it, or what they should do. Instead, based on her lengthy experience with Afghanistan, she'll be giving her personal perspective on how we can support our Afghan allies. I'm going to talk with her about her personal background there, who our Afghan allies are. But Dr. Brown, I'd like to start first with if you could give us some background on who the Taliban are and why we should be worried about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be with you all. And thank you for having me back. Well, the Taliban first rose to power in the mid-1990s, around 1994. They're a collection of former mujahideen These were guerrilla fighters that the United States, once supported in the fight against the Soviet Union. And of course, after the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989 from Afghanistan, the Mujahideen turned on one another, and the country was engulfed in a civil war. When the Taliban first started coming to power in like 1994 in southern Afghanistan, their presence was welcomed. Talib means student in Pashto, so Taliban is plural, is students. They were seen as, pious Muslims. They were Afghans. So they were welcomed by the Afghan people, especially when they were able to quell some civil unrest and violence brought on by warlords and that were terrorizing communities. And so they were welcomed when they ultimately did capture Kabul in 1996. Their takeover initially was not complete, throughout the country, not what we see today, but when they did capture Kabul in 1996 and they began to rule, their governance was extraordinarily harsh. So initially, while they were welcomed by many and continued to receive some, support in different pockets of the country, their rule was extraordinarily harsh. Life was extraordinarily bleak, especially for women who could not leave their homes, could not work. Music, television, the niceties in life essentially were banned and said to be kind of in a really strict adherence to Sharia law. It was a fundamentalist government. It was only recognized by two governments at the time, Pakistan and the United Arab Emirates. And of course, as we know, which is what led us to war in Afghanistan in 2001, was that it gave safe harbor to Al-Qaeda and to terrorist groups. We had an somewhat easy victory in 2001, relatively speaking, in Afghanistan when we launched the U.S. invasion on October 7th, 2001. The Taliban quickly crumbled, and but we celebrated maybe a little bit too soon and realized that they were regrouping with the support of the Pakistani intelligence service. So they have Pakistan's long seen the Taliban as a strategic asset. Of course, that is controversial, and I can't speak too much about Pakistan's view of the Taliban today, but they did receive support from Pakistan's ISI. They regrouped and they came back really into Afghanistan with a lot of power around 2006. And so the fighting escalated, for the United States, of course, there was a surge in 2009, 2010, when President Obama came to power. But as you all know, there's a lot of debate over how successful the U.S. military was against the Taliban, which ultimately led to this withdrawal. I think why we're concerned about them is because while we've seen the Taliban change, maybe and adapt to kind of a more modern environment, especially in Afghanistan cities. For instance, they're using social media, they're using television, and they say that they've changed and adapted, and even say that they want an inclusive government. A lot of Afghans do not trust this, and they're saying, especially the Afghans in the cities, and they're saying, watch what they do, not what they say. And so their human rights record is abysmal, and especially for our Afghan allies who supported the U.S. mission and Western governments' missions in the country, they fear that their lives are severely at risk with the Taliban in control.
Thank you. Who are our Afghan allies?
Yeah, so the U.S. mission in Afghanistan, the longest continuous military engagement in American history, meant that we've engaged hundreds of thousands of Afghans to support us. There's no way that the U.S. mission could have any kind of success or make any headway without the support of our Afghan colleagues. And so many Americans understand that with regard to the role that Afghans have played in supporting the U.S. military through being translators or, those who worked on American bases to support and nourish American soldiers and NATO International Security Assistance Force soldiers and Marines. So many know about our allies being military translators who qualify for the special immigrant visa, which was created, of course, to support translators both and those who supported American military in Afghanistan and Iraq. But also, I believe strongly that the word allies extends significantly to those who helped the civilian mission. What's gotten less attention in the United States is the copious amounts of diplomatic and development assistance that went into the country, and the scores of Afghans who worked side by side with us in the US Embassy, in USAID offices and provincial reconstruction teams across the country. But also, in addition to that, there's been billions of dollars has been poured into Afghan civil society. And so there's been many Afghans who may not have directly worked, inside an American embassy or a consulate or a PRT, but worked for an American-sponsored NGO, worked for an American media organization, worked on a cooperative agreement or a grant funded by the US Embassy that were also working for the US government. Those Afghan leaders, many of whom had participated in US exchange programs, particularly the International Visitor Leadership Program, those are our allies. Those are peoples who firmly believed in the US mission in their country and wanted to support it, signed up to do that, and those are the Afghans who are now at risk.
Aside from people who were working with us in one way or another, there appears to be another group of Afghans who perhaps blossomed under the US's presence and the other coalition members doing Western style work, women doctors, women teachers, women government bureaucrats. Do you consider them to be allies because of our presence, even though they may not have worked with us directly?
So I'm speaking about allies within the terms of the current Priority 2 visa program that has been set up. So there is the US Refugee Admissions Program that set up Priority 1 and Priority 2 visa status. And so Priority 2 visa status, those are the allies that I just spoke with, ones that worked, either directly or tangentially, for the US mission. And then there's the Afghans, of course, who really, especially women, who really stepped up into leadership roles in the fields of medicine and education, civil society, who also could qualify for some kind of US visa status through, through a referral from UNHCR or through some kind of humanitarian parole. I think these are Afghans that the ones that you identified whose lives and livelihoods are at severe risk as well, and that we should support them in gaining assistance. The Priority 2 visa that I explained, kind of the way that I think allies are being defined through our visa system, are the ones who directly supported the U.S. mission. So it's a little subjective. I do see that that Afghans who are not going to be able to work, who may be treated, whose human rights are at risk under Taliban, that they should receive some kind of refugee assistance.
The people who are within your definition of the allies, which I imagine is a pretty big group, what kind of support do they need right now?
Yeah, well, there's 3 different kind of levels of support depending on where they are. So for those who are in Afghanistan, and let me be clear, there's many Afghans who've decided to stay, especially those who run humanitarian assistance organizations and relief organizations. You hear about kind of big name organizations in the country, but the leadership, the people who run those offices are usually Afghans. So you have a lot of leaders who have decided to stay. And supporting them and their organizations, whether it be the International Rescue Committee, International Medical Corps, the local UN offices that are going to stay, they will need continued aid to help them in their work to support Afghan people. And there's also, ways that you can support, journalists and those who are staying, through the Committee to Protect Journalists and other organizations. The other kind of level of assistance and support is for the Afghans that were evacuated, but are now, who ultimately want to come to the United States, or they're trying to get to another country, but they are in a third country for visa processing. And so they are refugees, they're displaced. And that is another level of assistance that could happen, that you could provide through groups, like UNHCR, like the IRC again, but there's also Vital Voices Afghan Women's Fund, and these are all groups that'll make sure that the World Affairs Council has. But those are Afghans that do need help and do need assistance. Most of the Afghans that are waiting for U.S. visas in these third countries through P2 programs need a sponsor. I left that part out. Need a sponsor from a U.S. organization, but at the same time, we don't know how long they're going to be there, and we need to make sure that their needs are met. And some of the conditions, especially at air bases right now, are not ideal. And then there's the assistance to Afghans that have made it to the United States and that are coming to the United States. And I know that Sid has dropped into the chat here some local resources that are in Western Massachusetts. And I think it's the Jewish Family Services of Springfield that is the lead resettlement local organization that works with the state of Massachusetts. And there's also many other ways, to give. Airbnb is stepping up if you want to host a local family, an Afghan family locally, and provide housing. There's ways to do that. And I'll stop there and make sure I'm answering your question, but there's many different ways to step up and help. But I would qualify it as the Afghans that are in Afghanistan, those who are chosen to stay, those who do still want to leave, but are currently there, ones who are displaced and waiting for resettlement into the United States or another country, and those who've made it here to the United States.
That's a great answer. For those who want to help and may get involved, we were chatting a little bit before we started. Is there a danger if, let's say, you're helping someone and you're trying to talk to that person's other family members who may be in Afghanistan, if you are calling or texting or emailing, and are there things that Americans should think about before they do something like that, about encryption and things like that?
That's a great question. Digital security right now is absolutely critical. When we talk about the ways that the Taliban have evolved, they've become incredibly digitally savvy. This is not the same ragtag group of, since 1996. They have been fighting the world's most sophisticated military for the last 15, 20 years. And they've become quite savvy in their communications. And they know how they're very well versed in modern social media platforms. And so one of the most important things to do is that if you are friends or have professional contacts with anyone in Afghanistan, that you hide your friends list and that you hide your contacts list, so that there's no linkages, public linkages between them, and yourselves here in the United States. And then on top of that, there's a lot of excellent resources on digital security that I want to refer you to. Human Rights First is doing a wonderful job with this. So drop that link in the chat. And then there's also a group called Access Now that has various tips on erasing your digital footprint if you are an Afghan and you are at risk. But also it's good to read if you are wanting to communicate with Afghans, so that you can give them good advice on what to do if you do reach out. So right now, I think the practice is to reach out only through encrypted applications, WhatsApp or Signal, but to make sure that you're advising any Afghan that you're speaking with to erase that communication, to make sure that it disappears, or that the communication does not stay there in case their phones are confiscated by Taliban, and they do go ahead and look through your chats and contact lists.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. I think people would like to know a little bit about your experiences when you served in Afghanistan and what it was like to a typical day, typical interactions with your Afghan colleagues. What was that like? How well did you get to know them? That sort of thing.
Yeah. So I first arrived in Kabul in 2003. The U.S. mission at the time was fairly small. The focus really was on the U.S. mission in Iraq. So there was a pretty small footprint in the country at the time. But one of the first things that we did was reopen the various international exchange and cultural programs to engage Afghan youth and ensure that they were connected with peer networks in the United States and around the world, that they could develop their education and also develop their professional lives. And as part of that, help develop Afghan civil society. My colleagues at the embassy, my Afghan colleagues were absolutely tremendous. Many of them had served at the U.S. Embassy before it was closed in 1989, and also and continued to help through the U.S. consulate in Peshawar, Pakistan, during the Civil War and Taliban years. So they were incredibly committed to supporting the U.S. mission in Afghanistan, but really what captured my imagination and my heart was the emerging group of Afghan journalists that were in the country. Free speech was a new concept in 2001, 2002. It was very much encouraged by Hamid Karzai, interim and then elected president, to have a flourishing media industry. And so really watching the development of Afghan journalists was remarkable. It really encompassed the spirit of a lot of youth in wanting to see themselves reflected, in the country, and not essentially having to wait their turn to have high positions in government or in their communities, that they could shape the information landscape themselves. And what's, I think, the most remarkable thing is that if you look at surveying that was been done in Afghanistan over the years, the most trusted institution in the country was the Afghan news media. And so when you think about the people who really, especially kind of the generation that came of age the last 20 years, and you look at the free press and you look at civil society, it was one of the most astounding gains of the last 20 years. I am aware that, the country is very uneven, or it's patchwork, it's very different depending on where you're standing. So my experience in Afghanistan was mostly in Kabul and in the cities, and that's what I can speak to the best. But the Afghans I worked with, both on the U.S. mission and also in the Afghan news media, were some of the most inspiring individuals I've ever met. And I am in touch with them kind of as they make their decisions about whether or not to stay or leave. And especially the last couple of weeks when some of them did realize that their lives were at risk and they had to leave their job.
I was just going to ask you about that, so you segued into it very nicely. Just in general, what was your continuing contact with those folks? And not so much individually, what are they doing, but kind of as a group, let's just take the journalists. I assume that some of them are not in Afghanistan anymore. Is there any kind of voice against the Taliban? I think people would like to know about that. And by the way, folks, if you have questions for Dr. Brown, put them in the chat and we will try to get to them. But just to kind of get back, is there any voice against the Taliban, do you think? I know it's hard to say sitting where we sit right now, so maybe it's an unfair question, and if so, I apologize. But I just thought I'd like to hear your view on that.
I think what we're, I'm essentially reading the news that you are at the moment, which is essentially that you're seeing a lot of women's groups rise up, and then want to make sure their voices are heard and that they're part of, a new government that there is an inclusive government that includes women's rights. And we're seeing that the Taliban isn't taking to that resistance well. They're beating the protesters in the streets. I think what our hope is that the news media, the American news media, but also other international news media, stay in the country to be able to report out, so that we know whether or not the Taliban are keeping to their word, that they don't want any revenge, that they want an inclusive government, that they have changed, that this is not the Taliban of 25 years ago. And so it's really critical that we have that. I think for the Afghan journalists who I've been in touch with, or who, friends have been in touch with, some have gotten out, some have left, because they have been murdered. Their colleagues have been murdered by the Taliban right before the Taliban takeover of the country. They assassinated the head of the Government Media and Information Center at Kandahar. So they saw what they think their fate is going to be, and they did move on. Other journalists have decided to stay, have decided to continue to report out on what happens. And of course, if you follow the news, we know that a lot of the Voice of America journalists and, US government sponsored journalists are still there, and may or may not be leaving. So I think right now it's hard to answer your question because everyone's kind of in a holding pattern to know, is the Taliban going to stay true to their word? So far, the interim government they formed does not look good, that they will, but we're waiting to see kind of what happens. And we have to also wait and see what the diplomatic office, US government office in Doha, how that's set up and the kind of influence they can have, with this new government, to make sure that that human rights are upheld.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions from the attendees. One of them is about similar to what you were just talking about. Is there anything that either the United States government or I suppose American society can do to help professional women who may not fall into one of the categories who would qualify them for some kind of official visa or entry? Is there anything that we can do at all, or I suppose the people here can do?
I think there is, and I would refer you primarily to Vital Voices and their Afghan Women's Fund. Vital Voices is a phenomenal women's rights international, organization, and they've also been working with Milan Vivrier at Georgetown's. I believe it's women. Forgive me, I forget the exact name, but it's a women, I think, in international security, women in. It's a women's rights center set up through Georgetown University. It's also working with Vital Voices, as I believe. So they are, I think, in the process of reconfiguring their programs to support women in the country, and that would be the best source of truth, I think, on what we can do to assist Afghan women professionals who are still in the country and will remain in the country. I would refer you to them.
Thank you. You talked about the Taliban being Pashtun primarily. The other tribe, I suppose, or group, 25% or so of the country, the Tajiks, are in the city. Is that pretty much who is coming to America? We've got a question about is it kind of middle class, better educated folks coming to America who may already have left Afghanistan? Is that who is coming, or is it folks who are living up in the Korangal in the middle of nowhere?
I honestly don't know how to answer that question. I privately was a part of an evacuation effort that was extraordinarily chaotic. And as you can imagine, and knowing exactly the demographics of who was getting on planes, I know that many of them are people that qualify for SAVs. Obviously, the priority was put on American citizens and legal permanent residents and foreign nationals to get out of the country, but then also SAV applicants and those who qualify, for these special refugee assistance programs from the State Department. And everyone's currently going through vetting right now, kind of at these bases where people have been flown to before coming to the United States. But I can't say if they're Pashtun, if they're Tajik, if they're Hazara, if they're one of the many different minorities in the country, and exactly what their professions are. I can tell you that for what they had to go through to get to the airport, that they felt that their lives were in severe danger. And that's where we need to be compassionate and try to help.
We have another question, and it's about how is the Taliban takeover would affect Russia, which is nearby. But there's also Pakistan and Iran have interests in Afghanistan, surely. And I know that's kind of a broad strategic question. And is that okay to ask you that? I know you're not speaking for the State Department or anything like that, so I don't want to put you on the spot that way. But is that something that you can at least address a little bit?
Yeah, I'll do it probably in an unsatisfying way. So I'm sorry, but it's, Afghanistan is at the center of really rich geopolitics. It shares a border with Iran, with Pakistan, with a nuclear country, with with China. It shares border with Central Asia, which used to be the Soviet Union. Afghanistan is very used to having some kind of, foreign interference in the country, given its location, given it being in kind of at the intersection of South and Central and Asia and, and the Middle East. And so, there's obviously a lot of kind of interest in what happens there. I know that the Russian embassy has stayed open, so has the Chinese. And of course, Pakistan and Iran share long borders with Afghanistan, and also, are feeling the brunt of the refugee crisis as well. And so yeah, they will continue to have much interest in what happens there. And I think that part of this larger diplomatic game that's being played right now, or kind of negotiations that are at play right now, are to kind of see essentially what who does gain kind of the most influence with the Taliban, and who can promote their interests there.
I think that was a fair answer. That question about who's going to pay for all this, or who will pay for the people that the United States government is not willing to pay for, which I'm going to try to turn a little bit and say, what might be the role of the UN? Because I don't think we haven't discussed that, and it would seem that there might be some role. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, the United Nations, especially their agencies, especially UNHCR, UN High Commission of Refugees, and different, related organizations like the World Food Program, those will continue to provide aid and support to the Afghan people. And also UNHCR has a role in refugee resettlement as well, kind of as they wait in those third countries. So the United Nations, I believe, is expected to have a continued presence in the country and to support with the refugee issue outside of the United States, which I think is the question. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. The question came in kind of about funding more, I think, if what the US could do, but then if there's some limit to what the United States is willing to do, either an amount or for length of time, I just wonder, what you thought the role of the UN might be along that, which I think you've addressed. I've got another question here about understanding that your work was primarily in Kabul and related to the work in urban areas. Could you address how this will affect people out in the rural areas, what the Taliban takeover, and I suppose the effect on the families and lives of people?
Yeah, well, so That's a great question. And I would encourage you to read the work of Anand Gopal, who is a former NPR journalist, who wrote a book essentially about the view of the war really from the Afghan world perspective. And he has a recent piece in the New Yorker called The Other Afghan Women that looks at the perspective of the Taliban takeover in, I believe it's in Lashkar-Gah. It's in one of the southern provinces of Afghanistan, where the perspective there is different. Where that saw a lot of U.S. military action, and so a lot of Afghans suffered, from that being the kind of the hotbed of conflict with the U.S. military. And so I think it's important to understand that, we're talking about, the point of this conversation about supporting Afghan allies, supporting the Afghans who really, put their livelihoods at stake, and we believe as a result their lives at stake by supporting the U.S. mission, or kind of benefiting from these gains. But it's important to understand that Afghanistan's a very complex country, and there's different perspectives depending on where you're standing. So I don't have that personal experience in rural areas. Mostly that was a limitation for me as a fairly young woman at the time doing independent research and working with the U.S. mission. But I do encourage you to read, especially I think the work that Anand has done is really extraordinary for a Western journalist in the country. And I think it can give you that perspective. And thank you, Sid, for dropping that in the chat.
Yeah, I just want to let folks know, if you're not looking at the chat box, Sid is dropping in some great resources for everyone to look at. We've got a few minutes left. I'm still waiting to see if there are other questions. One of the ones I wanted to ask you is, it could be related to our specific topic today, but given your lengthy experience with Afghanistan, what is something or some things that you think you would really like people to know that they may not know, or that to appreciate that they may not appreciate in this time? Because there's a lot of focus on what gate was open and what airport we should use, but kind of more in the bigger picture. What do you think, from your experience, people should understand that are attending this chat we're having?
And I'm sorry, with regard to the actually evacuation effort the last couple of
Whatever,
months?
yeah, just
Yeah,
Afghanistan in general, the evacuation effort. If you've got a chance for your message for that, you think whether it's a misunderstanding or something like that people should know. It's your forum, so I just wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to say, gee, I wish I could say this. Well, here's your chance. So if there's nothing, that's fine. I've got other questions.
Oh, no. I think I would say that one of the reasons why this has been so intense is that there's a whole generation of young Americans who stepped up to serve after 9/11, either through the military or diplomatic means of development, or with NGOs as journalists, who spent a lot of time in this country and really developed a deep, deep affection for the Afghan people. And I think you didn't hear about a lot of that in the news, because our news is framed as, along, security terms. You're hearing about the conflict, you're hearing about, our troops, you're hearing about loss of life. But it was difficult, and so my book talks about, it's like difficult to really understand Afghanistan is a really multi-dimensional place and country, and what a just extraordinarily beautiful place it is, and what how extraordinarily warm and wonderful the Afghan people are, and how welcoming they were to all of us. So we really feel like they helped protect us when we were there, and we want to protect them. So it is very emotional for a lot of us. Excuse me. And it's very difficult to explain if you have not spent time there, about how meaningful the Afghan people and our allies are to us. So I'll stop there. One other thing I do want to explain too is that when you're thinking about what's happening and who's kind of taking Afghans in right now, that part of the larger diplomatic effort isn't just with the Taliban to make sure that we're keeping them accountable to what they pledge will happen, but also it's really working with third countries to welcome, Afghan refugees while they await resettlement somewhere. So there's a much larger diplomatic effort at play. So a lot of Afghans that former colleagues of mine and I helped evacuate, went to Uganda. And so the Ugandan government welcomed them there, and the American embassy there is helping them with visas. Many are in Albania, many are in Macedonia. And so part of the diplomatic effort right now is, okay, can there be land routes established? Which countries can host Afghan refugees while they're being vetted, for resettlement in the United States? That was another point I forgot to make.
Okay, that's why I ask those kind of questions. One of the other things is certainly we're trying to help as America. We went there, those folks worked with us, but there were other coalition members who I presume worked just as closely. My experience in other countries was that way. What are the other countries that came to Afghanistan, UK, Germany, you name it? What are they doing, to help resettle these folks?
Yeah, I can't speak to it completely, but I do know that, of course, two of our largest allies in the International Security Assistance Force, Germany and the UK, are also taking in Afghan refugees, but specifically ones that did help their missions, right? Of course. And so, because there's, as we know, immigration and refugee issues are, politically charged issues in many countries. So I can't speak too much on who's welcoming them. But I know that like Mexico is welcoming some, Colombia, others. There is quite a coalition of countries that have stepped up to support with Afghan refugee resettlement.
Just as a quick wrap up, is there, I know Sid has put some resources up on the chat. You have mentioned them. Is there anywhere else you think people it might be helpful for them to look if they want to be of help at some point? State Department and anywhere else? There's certainly plenty on the chat, but I just wanted to give you a chance to see where else people might go to help or learn things.
Yes, so I'm very partial to Human Rights First and their Evacuate Our Allies program. I think that they've got some great resources for advocacy and other digital security resources for legal assistance. In addition to that, the International Refugee Assistance Program is a great resource. And I think the Jewish Family Services, of course, is a great resource for you locally. And I believe there's a Catholic group as well. I'm sorry, I don't know their name, in Massachusetts. That is helping with refugee resettlement. But really, I think that, once there's more clarity that we will have, you'll see some groups trying to kind of more clarity about who can leave the country, who the Taliban is letting leave. We saw that they let several Americans, Canadians, I think, and Brits leave Kabul International Airport today, but they are not letting these charter flights leave Mazar-i-Sharif because they include Afghans at risk. So as kind of we have more clarity, I think you'll see these groups as being, that I mentioned, being good resources for Afghans who want to leave, but also, for Americans who want to support them. And all the other groups that Sid included in the chat. There's one, I just saw a question about Congress and advocacy. I'll say that we at Global Ties US, since the amount of focus that went into US public diplomacy the last 20 years, the billions of dollars that went into it, or maybe not billions, but hundreds of millions of dollars that went into it over the last 20 years, especially when it comes to supporting the building of Afghan civil society and the building of a liberal democracy and the building of a news media. It was impossible to have a leader kind of in those fields that wasn't a US exchange participant or wasn't part of the International Visitor Leadership Program, which the World Affairs Council supports. So they all qualify for this priority refugee status. So we will be stepping up to lead advocacy efforts to continue to make sure that they're not forgotten, and that if they do want to apply for these visas, that their path to do so is as simple as possible, because we know they're already dealing with so much else. So, so this, even though the intensity of the initial evacuation effort has come to a close, we're entering a new phase of advocacy, relief, and resettlement. And so there's much more work to be done.
Dr. Brown, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Sid to wrap things up, but I really appreciate your talking with us today.
Thank you.
Well, I also wanted to thank you and Steve. We pulled this together very quickly. I think we did it in less than a week, and I'm thrilled with how well it has gone. I also wanted to convey my thanks to you, Katherine, and the staff at Global Ties US for the extraordinary support that you and the State Department have extended to community-based members like us across the country who are involved in the International Visitor Leadership Program, not just with Afghans, but with people from all over the world over these last COVID years. I am pretty sure we wouldn't have been able to get through it without you, not only financially, but in terms of training and support and the occasional shoulder to cry on. I am grateful to you and to everybody at Global Ties. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to our audience. I hope we see you again on September 22nd. And I hope if you're interested, you will reach out to some of those groups and learn more about Afghans and how we might support them in our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you.